Introduction. The previous chapter highlighted cases where well-intentioned educators imposed techno-social engineering on students. In stark contrast, this chapter addresses examples where it is self-directed. We focus on delegating physical, cognitive, emotional, and ethical labor to a third party, often through technical devices, systems, and applications. This is known as outsourcing. Rational people choose to outsource for lots of reasons, including to save time and other limited resources. From an efficiency-oriented perspective, outsourcing can be a beneficial process. A slightly wider lens shows how outsourcing may have unintended consequences and trade-offs. Outsourcing has 6 existential characteristics. First, passivity. As we accept assistance, we lessen the personal effort needed to accomplish a goal. As effort diminishes, passivity takes hold. At a certain level, we become akin to spectators rather than active participants. Second, decreased agency. We participate in less of the process than we would if we performed it ourselves. Less effort results in a corresponding reduction in our experience of the action itself. Our behavior becomes less intentional and some measure of control is lost. Third, decreased responsibility. By abdicating control over a process, we can become less culpable for how things turn out. This is a double-edged sword. The very reason that we can become less blameworthy can also leave us entitled to feel proud of positive results. When something amazing happens through collaboration, nobody deserves all the credit. Fourth, increased ignorance. Delegation of tasks can limit our understanding of how a process works. Even if proxies seem reliable, we don't know the full extent of how they work on our behalf. In the case of technology, outsourcing happens by translating our requests into algorithmic or mechanical processes that computers, which don't always behave the way we do, can perform. Fifth, detachment. Diminished participation leads to disengagement. The more intense the detachment, the less intimate an experience becomes. At the extreme, less intimacy results in alienation. Sixth, decreased independence. When outsourcing becomes habitual, we become dependent on a third party for getting stuff done. At the extreme, dependency can result in de-skilling. We can forget how to perform a task or become less capable of doing it. Or we can lose the motivation to increase our knowledge and skills. Outsourcing affects more than how a task is completed. When deciding whether to outsource, we need to consider whether it's worth losing agency, responsibility, control, intimacy, and possibly knowledge and skill. We address these issues by critically discussing a specific form of outsourcing: outsourced navigation. Actuated navigation. Max Pfeiffer, a researcher in the Human-Computer Interaction Group at the University of Hanover in Germany, ran an experiment where he manipulated how students navigated through a park. By stimulating their sartorius muscles with electrical current, he directly guided their turns, nudging movements to the left and right. While this scenario sounds like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, apparently the combination of existing smartphone technology and electrodes is all that's needed to inaugurate an innovative pedestrian navigation paradigm. Pfeiffer successfully assumed the role of an aggressive GPS device, but his prototype isn't ready to compete with Waze. The successful proof of concept makes it hard to avoid speculating about the future, fully automated consumer versions of the technology. Pfeiffer and his collaborators imagine a range of socially beneficial applications. Their vision revolves around 3 types of experience: multitasking, dispensing precise geolocation information, and coordinating group movement. These are embodied in several appealing scenarios, including enhanced fitness, such as runners trying out new routes and optimizing existing routines; novel sports, coaches literally choreographing how their teams move; improved job performance, firefighters effortlessly zeroing in on danger zones; upgraded crowd control, concert-goers' ability to evacuate in an orderly and calm manner if an emergency arises; and low transaction cost navigation. Let's confront the basic moral and political question of outsourcing. To narrow our focus, consider the case of guided strolling. On the plus side, Pfeiffer suggests that senior citizens appreciate help returning home when they're feeling discombobulated, tourists will enjoy seeing more sights while with the pedestrian version of cruise control, and friends, family, and coworkers will get more out of life by safely throwing themselves into engrossing, peripatetic conversation. What of the potential downside? Critics identified several concerns with using current forms of GPS technology. They have reservations about devices that merely cue us with written instructions, verbal cues, and maps that update in real time. Technology writer and philosopher Nicholas Carr warns of our susceptibility to automation bias and complacency, psychological outcomes that can lead people to do foolish things, like ignoring common sense and driving a car into a lake. Philosophers Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Kelly lament that it's dehumanizing. to succumb to GPS orientation because it trivializes the art of navigation and leaves us without a rich sense of where we are and where we're going. Technical fixes can correct the mistakes that would guide zombified walkers into open sewer holes and oncoming traffic. However, the value of knowing and even not knowing where one stands in relation to our physical environment and to others remains a more vexing existential and social problem. Being lost and struggling with the uncertainty may provide us with opportunities to develop ourselves and our relationships. Pfeiffer himself recognizes this dilemma. He told Wired that he hopes his technology can help liberate people from the tyranny of walking around with their downcast eyes buried in smartphone maps. He admitted that, when freed from the responsibility of navigating, most of his volunteers wanted to check email as they walked. At stake is the risk of unintentionally turning the current dream of autonomous vehicles into a model for locomotion writ large. While the hype surrounding driverless cars focuses on many intended benefits, such as fewer accidents, greener environmental impact, less congestion, furthering the shift to communal transportation, we can't lose sight of the fact that consumers are wooed with utopian images of time management. Freed from the burden of needing to concentrate on the road, we're sold on the hope of having more productive commutes. Instead of engaging in precarious and often illegal acts of distracted driving, we'll supposedly tend to our correspondence obligations in a calm and civilized way. Hallelujah! We'll text, email, and post on social media in our private office on wheels, just as if we were on a bus, train, or plane, all without having to deal with pesky strangers. Pfeiffer's research demonstrates that a designer's intentions don't determine how consumers use technology. In a world where social and professional expectations pressurize people to be online, the temptation to exploit newly found schedule openings for this purpose will be immense. When industries get a sense that people have more time to attend to work-related activities, expectations will ratchet up accordingly. This pressure disincentivizes us from pursuing offline lives and makes a mockery of the cliché, if you don't like it, don't use it. Just as historical decisions about building infrastructure to support a suburban culture have made walking to work less tenable for many people, shifts in the digital ecosystem can make it harder to take an enjoyable offline stroll. The prospect of being further chained to our devices is disturbing. The thought of outsourcing our physical abilities to free up attention raises a more disconcerting problem, one with deep psychological and metaphysical consequences. Actuated navigation isn't just a process that turns voluntary into involuntary behavior. If done habitually, it's an invitation to dissociate from our physicality and objectify our bodies as mere commodities. To see why, let's consider some basic ways bodies and technologies interact. Bodies, technology, and outsourcing creep. Many people rely on prosthetics, such as canes, walkers, wheelchairs, and artificial limbs, to move freely. These deeply embodied tools expand a person's sense of agency. They are particularly powerful when society commits the resources for accessibility and embraces a sense of justice and equality for anyone relying on them. Let's approach this in experiential terms. As the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty argues, a blind person can't use a cane to see colors. The act of tapping just can't reveal how gray a street looks, at least not yet. Technology can expand perceptual abilities by extending the scope and active radius of touch and providing a parallel to sight. Indeed, the person who becomes expert at using a cane experiences the stick as a direct extension of being, a sense organ that's attuned to the world, not an external object that requires attention-grabbing, mechanical movements to master. A seasoned driver feels that a car is an extension in a similar way. She gets in, cranks up the tunes, navigates on the highway while singing along, and arrives at her destination delighted that she became one with the vehicle and intuitively exhibited skill. By contrast, a beginner's journey involves deliberating and a pronounced sense of separateness. Beyond needing to pause to consider who gets the right-of-way at a four-way stop, she needs to engage in all kinds of abstract reflections, like explicitly focusing on putting her hands on the 9-3 position before starting to drive. The prosthetic and driving examples show that we're quite adept at using technology to expand our embodied relation to the world and with it our sense of identity. In a suburban area, for example, it's easier for the person with vehicle access to see herself as independent than it is for someone who depends on public transportation, where schedules are set by others. While this case may be objectionable from a moral point of view, for example, not everyone can afford to opt out of public transportation, and it may be environmentally wrong not to use it, the basic phenomenology of enlarged capacities shows that it's a mistake to see so-called cyborg fusions as inherently alienating. What is different between outsourcing walking and getting around with the help of a cane or car? That's easy to answer in the case of malicious hacking. If a third party engaged in a version of Pfeiffer's experiment that enabled her to take over our body and move us in directions that we didn't want to go, our autonomy would be violated. But if we freely choose a destination and actuated navigation helped us get there straight away without any imposed stops, our autonomy apparently would be respected. Turning to outsourced walking for the purpose of freeing up our attention is an act that so strongly privileges mental activity that it effectively treats the body as nothing more than an impediment that needs to be overcome. Our bodily engagement with the physical world becomes seen as a logistical and navigational transaction cost to be minimized, even eliminated if possible. By this logic, why surrender only a single physical ability? Why not outsource other movements that prevent us from being totally engrossed in intellectual activities? Chewing, showering, shaving are nothing but corporeal subversions that get in the way of more elevated affairs. Perhaps even the effort to raise our cheeks to smile is a waste. Why not eliminate it and purchase an app that triggers the requisite movements when it detects patterns that make smiling appropriate? Where do we draw the line, and why? Is smiling an essential component of our unique identities? Consider Batman's enemy, the Joker, a villain who appears existentially menacing because his face is forever frozen and incapable of fully conveying expression. Some of you might find outsourcing as much bodily movement as possible attractive, and yearn for the day that consciousness can be uploaded to a machine. For some transhumanists, this is indeed the moment we can finally evolve beyond recognizable human limits and start living the good life. Futurist Raymond Kurzweil, director of engineering at Google, predicts that by 2030, our brains will be able to connect directly to the cloud, and not too long after, we'll also be able to fully back up our brains. We encourage supporters to consider that, although it may not be immediately obvious, the optimizing logic that makes it attractive to outsource away bodily functions applies to mental operations too. Once the outsourcing spiral commences, we may regret where it ends. Others will feel diminished by autopilot dualism that makes our bodies mere cogs in the machine of our mental life. If you fall into this camp, it's empowering to move beyond gut feelings and vague impressions of discomfort and figure out exactly what's the basis of your opposition. There are many ways a purely mental life could be lived. In ancient Greece, for example, Aristotle depicted God as an immaterial prime mover who only thinks about his own eternal thinking. For our purposes, a decent place to start is the Matrix. Imagine human bodies are tethered to vats while human minds live virtual lives in a programmed simulation of our current world. In this scenario, human beings still needed to grapple with the same physical interactions that we currently do. They climb stairs, they open door, they cook food. Why does this familiar narrative persist? A compelling explanation is that the programmers recognize the structure is necessary for our mental life to be satisfying and meaningful. The optimizing logic we've discussed in this chapter persists. If so, there would be a desire for further reductions in transaction costs and more easily obtained bliss. Where would that lead us? A vicious cycle where outsourcing occurs in the virtual world? An ever-narrowing spiral? But to what end? If autonomy is retained, we presumably still have decisions to make about our purely mental lives. If we retain free will, we still presumably must experiment with different kinds of experiences to form our preferences. We presumably must learn to develop interesting beliefs and contested knowledge. But making decisions, experimenting, and learning, among other mental processes, are costly endeavors. Optimizing logic would seem to press toward minimizing and, if possible, eliminating these costs. To what end? The answer? Cheap bliss.